Every kid loved Joe Louis. He's the big hero.
He became a symbol of decency in a nasty game, prize fighting. But he also became a sort of symbol of how much we could do if we made up our minds to do it. I like the names that he was given. The Brown Bomber. Oh, man, I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. Bomb him, Joe. Bomb him.
Most of the things that happened to us in relation to the white community that we objected to were physical, and there were lynchings, and there were beatings, and there were things where physically we had to suffer. Joe Louis, coming along, stated our capacity to defend ourselves, given a half chance.
His color was always an issue, no matter how good he was. In those days, opportunities were limited, even in sports.
At the time, no black man could be heavyweight champion of the world. White America kept the heavyweight championship as their province, ever since Jack Johnson and the legacy of Jack Johnson.
From 1908 to 1915, Jack Johnson reigned as an unbeatable, even arrogant heavyweight champion, and the boxing establishment searched for a great white hope to beat him. On the day he humiliated their most promising challenger, Jim Jeffries, white racial attacks around the country left 8 blacks dead and scores injured. Johnson's flamboyant success so offended boxing's powers that they vowed never again to a black champion.
The fact of the matter is Joe Louis would have never done that anyway. He was reserved, he was caring, he was loving, he was never braggadocious, because that was his upbringing. That was the family life that he had. He was 7th of 8 children in Chambers County, Alabama, and they were sharecroppers, and I suspect they would have still stayed in Alabama, except one night my grandmother and my step-grandfather, Pat Brooks, were coming back from visiting a person across the county. And all of a sudden they were stopped by the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan was going to pull them out of the car and do whatever that they do. And all of a sudden this person recognized Pat Brooks and said, "Oh, that's Pat Brooks. He's a good nigger. Let's leave him alone."
For years, the Klan had terrorized Southern blacks with beatings and lynchings. But mob justice went beyond the Klan and beyond the South. In 1933, in the depths of the Depression, 28 lynchings were reported, more than 3 times the number of the year before. No one knows how many went unreported.
The lesson of the lynching was very clear to us, that you, as a black person, have a certain position, and you better maintain that position, because if you get out of it, this is the punishment. It's not a question of justice or right or wrong or law, This is something that we have the right to do, and we will do it.
That October, on Maryland's eastern shore, police arrested George Armwood, a retarded 22-year-old black man, for allegedly assaulting an 82-year-old white woman.
The townspeople had broadcast they were going to lynch George Armwood prior to his even being charged with an offense. He had simply been arrested at that point.
Sensing trouble, the Baltimore Afro-American sent cub reporter Clarence Mitchell to Princess Anne on his first out-of-town assignment.
That drive to Princess Anne by my father, he said, was with a lot of mixed emotions, because there had been threats made against any Afro-reporters coming in to record this, and generally all reporters.
When I went out on the porch, I saw these 5 big men around a telephone pole, and they were trying to pull it up. And what they were trying to do was to get the telephone pole used as a battering ram to break the jail door in.
They broke into jail. I think, from what I've heard, that when they threw him down those steps, which was about 20 steps, and they're steel steps, that he was dead before they ever took him out of the jail.
I could see this mob coming towards us. And perhaps there were about 300 or 400 people in the mob. And they were yelling and screaming, and it was just horrible.
They hung George up the tree, and then they took him down, put him behind the car, and started back towards town.
They were dragging the poor devil by a rope, had tied around his neck. Of course, he was dead. And by that time, the dirt and everything, he was sort of black and disheveled, just all over. And they took him and about 2 blocks from where we were standing and dumped him in a lumber yard.
It was a terrible sight to see, badly burnt body, and his ears was missing, his penis was missing, and it just made you feel like you wanted to vomit.
My father said that they allowed him to interview people because they wanted blacks. They figured an Afro reporter would really let blacks know what would happen to blacks if they got out of line. And he began to talk with whites, and he saw a young white mother bringing her child, who was no more than 7 or 8 years old, to walk by and look at this charred body and said, "Look how we barbecued that nigger."
No one ever stood trial for the murder of George Armwood. When Clarence Mitchell returned to Baltimore, he spoke out at local church and youth groups and condemned Princess Anne officials for failing to prevent the lynching.
Clarence told us in detail exactly what happened. It was horrible. You felt a deep anger. It was a frustrating anger.
Baltimore's black community marched in protest. Lynchings were becoming front-page news around the country as mob violence hit 6 states over the next 2 months. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People led anti-lynching groups from both North and South to urge President Roosevelt to take a public stand. In a radio address on December 6th, the president called lynching a vile form of collective murder. "We do not excuse," he said, "those in high places or low who condone it." Ending lynching in America became the #1 priority for Walter White, the NAACP's executive secretary. A light-skinned black man, White had spent 9 years as an NAACP field investigator.
His assignment was to become a witness to lynchings. He, more often than most people knew, was able to mingle with the lynch crowds because he looked white. And this way he gained a great deal of first-hand information about the lynchings.
What Walter White observed was indifference and even collusion by local authorities. Mobs were getting away with the crime of murder.
We always knew that the sheriff and his cohorts and some of the police were also members of the Ku Klux Klan. It was open intimidation, part of the political process. And there were few people in the white community who raised any objections to it. We talked about it in our pulpits and in school and things like that. But we knew that to go to the law to get protected against lynching, no, that was a total waste of time.
But New Deal changes led Walter White to believe that Washington might enforce what local lawmen would not. In February 1934, he testified in Congress for a bill to impose heavy fines on communities that failed to prevent or prosecute lynchings. To escape racial violence and find prosperity, thousands of Southern blacks moved north. Joe Louis Barrow's family found work and settled in Detroit in 1927. But by 1933, they, like so many others, were out of work and on relief. Yet Joe's mother never gave up wanting him to be somebody.
My grandmother wanted him to be a violinist. And, here was my father, a big, huge, strong individual, and his good buddy Thurston McKinney said, Joe, you can't be playing no fiddle. You got to be in the boxing ring. So he was using the 25 cents that my grandmother was giving him for violin lessons to rent a Lockhart Brewster gymnasium. So he does this for about 6 or 7 weeks until the violin instructor comes by the house and says, Miss Brooks, where's my student? And she says, what do you mean, where's your student? Well, he hasn't been in his violin lessons. Well, that Joe's been telling me he's been in those violin lessons. So I like to say that night when he came home, he had a little come to Jesus, because his mother wanted to know where that 25 cents was going, because in those days, 25 cents was 25 cents. And he explained to her that he was using it for boxing, and she didn't like it, but she said, Joe, if you want to be a boxer, you be the best boxer you can.
In the ring, Joe Louis Barrow became known as Joe Louis. His impressive amateur showings attracted an all-black management team headed by John Roxborough. On July 4th, 1934, Louis turned pro.
If any of y'all people's going out tonight, let's go and see Joe Louis fight.
In his first 6 months, Louis won all 12 of his fights, 10 by knockout. He became boxing's new sensation.
With all the prejudice and segregation, there was a real question whether or not my father would ever get a shot at the title, and John Roxborough knew that. I mean, John Roxborough approached Madison Square Garden and the powers to be, and the realities are they weren't going to listen to him.
Roxborough knew they needed a white ally to make it to the big time. He found him in promoter Mike Jacobs. Within a few months, Jacobs landed a showcase fight at Yankee Stadium against former heavyweight champ Primo Carnera. They called him the Italian Giant. Carnera measured 6'6", wore size 22 shoes, and was a favorite of Italy's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini.
And here's the Italian Alp at Hot Springs, Arkansas, feeling as fit as the well-known fiddle and ready to go against the 21-year-old Black Shadow Joe Louis, whom he meets in the Yankee Stadium on June 25th.
But no promoter could have dreamed up the world events that gave the matchup its dramatic twist. In the spring of 1935, as the fight approached, Mussolini's Italian army threatened to invade Ethiopia, one of the 2 uncolonized nations in Africa.
In far-off Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie, looking over his snappy and quite modern fighting men, makes it plain that he means to be ready.
It was a source of considerable pride to blacks that here was at least one black nation with a black leader. And I think that there was no question but that they wanted Ethiopia to win.
American volunteers for service in Ethiopia flocked to sign up. More than 500 have enlisted. Listen to them.
What's your age, Mr. Anderson?
37.
37. What is your weight?
150 pounds.
When Louis met Carnera on June 25th, the 2 fighters brought a conflict half a world away into a 16 by 16 foot boxing ring.
Come on, Joe, let's go. Stuff's really mellow on the Alamo. Hey, let's go, Joe. Knock me something, 'cause I'm ready to go. Me classic, me Joe. Knock me something, 'cause I'm ready to go.
I think this was probably as much the making of Joe. It's so dramatic. So many knockdowns about this big guy who incidentally could hit, and Joe had to take a few. But at the finish, you had to be impressed with all of these things when you saw Joe Louis.
Joe became a celebrity. They started writing songs and poems, and would even name a soft drink after him. On September 24th, 1935, he got married. Then went out to Yankee Stadium and beat #1 contender Max Baer. The next day, Harlem turned out to greet Joe and his new bride.
Mr. Louis, you are a happy man today, aren't you?
Yeah, very happy.
Doubly happy.
Yeah,
what makes you more happy, to beat Baer or to be married to this charming lady?
I think to be married. Who is going to be the boss? You were the boss in the ring last night, Mr. Louis.
I'm the boss home, too.
Is that right, Mrs. Louis? Mrs. Lewis, could you speak up good and loud?
It was a hard fight, and not only that, I saw more than one Joe Louis in that ring. It looked like whole Harlem was there. In this little ray of sunshine, you know, he couldn't go through those clouds. Too many dark ones.
Not everyone loved Joe. Racial caricatures in the press derided his success.
Joe was our avenging angel, deployed against the enemy and knocking them down as fast as they could rise up. He was spiritually necessary to our sense of who we were, to our manhood, to our vision of eventual justice, to our true belief that given 1/10 of a chance, there was no field that we couldn't conquer.
While Joe Louis fueled the aspirations of Depression-era blacks, Charles Houston was working to tear down racial barriers. As dean of Howard University Law School, Houston trained a new generation of black lawyers to become what he called engineers for social change. When he took over as the NAACP's legal director in 1935, he brought with him a strategy to end segregation in America. For nearly 40 years, the Supreme Court had permitted racially separate public facilities, as long as they were equal. Houston took a movie camera down south to document that in segregated schools, separate was rarely equal.
When I taught, the benches that were worn out, old benches, went to the black school, and new benches and new books went to the white schools. And they sent the old books over to the black school to be used. And you can imagine an old book with the pages turned and the edges worn.
I had never seen a new book until Mrs. Flowers brought books from the white school for me to read. The slick pages, I couldn't believe it. And that's when I think my first anger, real anger, at a depressive and oppressive system began.
Houston believed that the fight for equality had to begin with desegregation, and that the place to start was in the schools.
He felt that you could not do this by having a broadside frontal attack and wipe out all segregation and all inequalities. That this would simply cause a backlash, and it would frighten whites and anger whites, but it would frighten a lot of blacks too, because the black middle class was largely supported by the salaries that school teachers earned.
Black teachers took such pride in black students, and the community took such pride in smart students, that a child who had gotten A's would be marched from one church to another. And people would say, now here's his brother so-and-so's little boy. Here he is. Here's little Johnny. Stand up, Johnny. Johnny got all A's this week, or all A's this past year. People who, he didn't belong to that church. People would stand up, praise the Lord, bless his heart. God bless you, honey. Keep on pressing on. So people took pride in the children, and their pride was an encouragement to continue. So we thought, with the larger society saying, you cannot, we thought, yes, we could.
Charles Houston took his first historic step against segregation when he took the University of Maryland to court. In the spring of 1935, he and his protege, Thurgood Marshall, selected Amherst College graduate Donald Gaines Murray to apply to the all-white university's law school. As expected, the school refused the well-qualified Murray's application.
They would pay tuition for us to go out of state to get a college education or a professional degree, rather than admit us to any of the state institutions of higher learning.
Nobody believed, no one believed, that he would win, that he would be allowed to enter. Yet they were hopeful. And you know, we pray a lot.
To prove their case, Houston and Marshall used the university's own separate but equal policy. Since Maryland did not operate a separate law school for blacks, they argued that the state university was obligated to enroll Murray in its all-white law school. That same afternoon, the judge ordered the university to admit Donald Murray.
The courtroom erupted in jubilation. As my father said, he knew there was a God, because this was a miracle. Here, just 2 years before, a man had been lynched, and here was a judge saying that we as blacks had a constitutional right to an equal educational opportunity.
Oh, the excitement, the cheering, the pride we felt.
And it was a significant victory. If you look at it, had that not happened, how many more years would we have waited to try to crack open that door again?
These were hopeful times for the NAACP's leaders. While Charles Houston pursued new victories in the courts, Walter White took the drive for an anti-lynching law to the White House and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt was really where the buck stopped for us in the black community. And we always felt that if she guaranteed something, it would happen. And that she was always not only going to be fair, but she's going to go out of her way to make sure that we in the black community were included.
Eleanor Roosevelt worked publicly and behind the scenes to open up the administration to black Americans. She actively supported the NAACP. She helped win the appointment of educator Mary McLeod Bethune to the National Youth Administration. In 1936, she invited noted African-American contralto Marian Anderson to sing at the White House. Miss Anderson had spent more than 10 years touring abroad after most U.S. opera companies refused to hire her. Mrs. Roosevelt also proved to be one of Walter White's most valued allies in his fight against lynching.
Mrs. Roosevelt would discuss with the president, and she would be the link, she was the bridge, so that the president would sometimes see Walter White when he had no intention of seeing him. He didn't see that many people.
In May 1934, Walter White went to the White House and found the president in a cheerful mood. While FDR preferred spinning a good story, White persistently steered the conversation back to the anti-lynching bill. The president sympathized with his arguments, but would not promise a public endorsement. On October 26th, national press and radio announced the planned lynching in Florida of a black murder suspect named Claude Neal. Walter White quickly rallied supporters to send a barrage of telegrams to Governor David Schultz, demanding he send state militia to prevent the lynching. But Schultz could not legally act without a request from local authorities. The request never came. That night, Claude Neal was murdered, then mutilated by a mob of more than 1,000 men, women, and children. His fingers and toes were taken as souvenirs. No arrests were ever made. Five months later, the Senate Judiciary Committee recommended the controversial anti-lynching bill to the full Senate. But the president refused to risk pending New Deal legislation by publicly supporting it.
For FDR, it was a very real problem because of the dominance of all the people whose cooperation he needed in Congress. They were all Southern Democrats, all of whom would have had their heads handed to them by their constituencies had they supported an anti-lynch bill in Congress.
Walter White denounced Roosevelt's continued silence and resigned his post as a presidential advisor on the Virgin Islands. "In justice to the cause I serve," he wrote FDR, "I cannot remain even a small part of your official family."
Now listen, all you prize fighters who don't want to meet defeat.
The undefeated Joe Louis continued to excite and divide the American public. In the spring of 1936, he trained for his biggest fight yet, Germany's ex-world champion, Max Schmeling.
Take a tip from me, see all Joe Louis's beat.
For those looking for a great white hope, Schmeling was it.
Have you discovered any particular weakness in the brown bomber?
Yes, I did, but I won't tell.
Oh, I blow through him. Ships go round and round out here. Oh, it comes out here.
On a muggy night in June, Joe Louis entered the Yankee Stadium ring a 10-1 favorite over Max Schmeling. Louis was more than a fighter now. He was the most talked about and written about black man in the country.
In the annals of Christiana, Joe Louis.
When Joe Louis fought, everybody listened around that radio. Whites, black, rich, poor, north, south, east, or west. It was a cultural phenomena.
The Joe Louis fight was like a carnival on our block because every house had the radio on blasting.
When there was a significant blow or anything happened that was worthy of note, we would explode, hit each other on the back, and knock each other to the floor. We would do violence in our expression of, we would become Joe Louis, and whoever was next to us would be the opponent. You know how boys can do.
And there we are. And they got to the ring right together with Arthur Donovan, Stepper and Brown, and Joe Louis.
Uncle Willie had turned the radio up to its last notch so that youngsters on the porch wouldn't miss a word. Women sat on kitchen chairs, dining room chairs, stools, and upturned wooden boxes. Small children and babies perched on every lap available, and men leaned on the shelves or on each other. One man said, "I ain't worried about this fight. Joe gonna whip that cracker like it's open season." Another said, "He gonna whip him till that white boy call him mama."
Snarling in the center of the ring, Louis following him up and lashing out with his left hand every now and then. And there was a hard right hand with his jaw. Louis ducked, put up his glove. Snelling got a hard right hand to Louis's jaw, and Louis is down.
All the people in the store shouted, "No!" Babies slid to the floor. Women stood up. Men leaned toward the radio. We didn't breathe. We didn't hope. We waited.
Snelling got over two more hard rights to Louis's jaw and made Louis give ground. And there Snelling straightened up Louis with hard rights and left to the jaw. He has puffed up Louis's left cheek, and Louis is down. Louis is down, hanging to the rope, hanging badly.
My race groaned. It was our people falling. It was another lynching. One more woman ambushed and raped. It was a white woman slapping her maid for being forgetful. This might be the end of the world.
We were stunned. We were voiceless. The agony went beyond words or recrimination.
It was almost like a funereal air that descended on Harlem. And by the next morning, people were going around as if they'd lost their last friend. Joe had been beaten. It was hard to believe.
After Max Schmeling won the first fight with Joe Louis, and blacks following that were very much distressed and humiliated, they didn't have to wait long for a real triumph. And that was when Jesse Owens went to Berlin for the Olympics.
The 1936 Olympics were to be Adolf Hitler's showcase for his racial theory of Aryan superiority over Jews, blacks, and other non-Aryans. By that time, Nazi law had stripped German Jews of their citizenship. Hitler was confident his athletes would triumph. He didn't count on Jesse Owens.
On the first day of the games, he fulfills ambition number one as per tryout form. On the second day, he makes it a doubleheader.
Jesse was so popular, he had to use a secret entranceway and exit to go into the stadium and out of the stadium, else he would have been mobbed. He was just the most popular man, in addition to Adolf Hitler, in Berlin in those days.
After Owens won his 3 scheduled events, the coaches made an unexpected move. They altered the lineup of the 400-meter relay team that had trained specially for the games.
We were told Sam Stoller and I were going to be replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf. I, as a brash 18-year-old, suggested to the coaches that there might be a furor back in the States wherein the only 2 Jews on the track team were not going to compete in the Olympic Games. And at that point, Jesse said, "Coach, I've won my 3 gold medals. I'm tired. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it."
And here in a smashing finale to a thrilling day, the 400-meter relay sees Jesse Owens, lead-off man, blazing the baton trail for the American quartet and picking up a 4-yard lead. From Owens, the stick goes to Ralph Metcalf, second lane from the inside. The colored streak tears around the clay.
Sam and I sat in the stands, and as Ralph Metcalf ran the second leg down the backstretch, I felt myself thinking, feeling, that should be me out there.
As Draper goes flying in the lead, Frank Wyckoff is on his toes for the touchdown.
Any of the sprinters in combination could have won that race handily.
Provides a record-breaking climax to America's world supremacy in track and field.
Years later, Ralph Metcalf, the other substitute runner, recalled the coach's decision.
I resented the fact that they left 2 Jewish boys off of the team, Stoller and Marty Glickman, in order to satisfy the Nazi people over there. And I protested. It didn't do any good, as you noticed, because they ran it according to the way Dean Cromwell wanted it run, with his 2 men running second, third, and fourth.
It's my belief that Avery Brundage was sympathetic to the Nazi cause and wished not to further embarrass the German authorities, the Nazis, by having Jews stand on the winning podium.
2 months later, Avery Brundage openly praised the Nazi government at a rally in New York's Madison Square Garden. Hitler and his racial policies had already found a following in the United States.
Troops bearing a foreign uniform have been drilling in 19 American cities. Hitlerism has invaded America.
In the 30s, there were 2 causes for the rise of anti-Semitism. The growth of Nazism in Germany with the movement of propaganda into this country. The Depression, which gave the average American the need to find out who was the fault for his not working, for his having to sell apples on the street.
Hard times bred fear, and fear often bred hatred. While anti-Semitism was not new to America, by the 1930s there were over 100 hate groups in the U.S. The Black Legion, the Ku Klux Klan, the German-American Bund among them. No 2 were exactly alike, but many blamed the Jews for the Depression. The arguments ran 2 ways. Jews were either the capitalist bankers that ruined the economy, or they were the communist revolutionaries out to destroy capitalism. In certain circles, the New Deal became known as the Jew Deal.
This Los Angeles bookshop of the Silver Shirts, dispensing anti-Jewish propaganda, is one of many that have recently opened all over the country. Note the name, Aryan Bookstore.
Silver Ranger, late paper. Free speech stopped by Jew riot. Paid paper.
At that time, we were able to count perhaps 35 anti-Semitic street corner meetings a week, telling the audience that Jews were taught by their Bible to kill little Christian girls, to use their blood for ritual Passover purposes. That was the kind of garbage that they were pouring out at meetings all over New York City.
Not all anti-Semites were so extreme or so explicit, but they still preached intolerance. The Charles Coughlin's Sunday afternoon radio talks reached as many as 10 million listeners. At his peak, the Detroit priest received more mail than anyone in the country, including the president.
I ask you if you will rise in your places and pledge with me to restore America to the Americans.
America to the Americans. Words that meant keeping America native-born Christian white. The walls of illusion beginning to break down. For the first time in a generation, a black man was fighting the world's heavyweight championship. Joe Louis worked his way back from his stunning loss to Schmeling by knocking out 10 of his next 11 opponents. On June 22, 1937, he finally got his shot at champion Jim Braddock.
Braddock is down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. A new world champion. Joe Louis is the new world
champion of the world. A black boy. Some black mother's son. Some black father's son. He was the strongest man in the world. People drank Coca-Colas like ambrosia and ate candy bars like Christmas.
Oh, it was Christmas, New Year's, every holiday all boiled into one. They were actually dancing in the streets that night.
It would take an hour or more before the people would leave the store and head for home. Those who lived too far had made arrangements to stay in town. You see, it wouldn't do for a black man and his family to be caught on a lonely country road in the South when Joe Louis had just proved that a black man was the strongest person in the world.
Even though my father was heavyweight champion of the world, he was still a black man. And America reminded him constantly. Even though sometimes they wanted to open the doors for him, he always felt very strongly that if his black brothers and sisters couldn't walk through those same doors the next day, then he wouldn't do it.
Duck Hill, Mississippi. In April 1937, a lynch mob chained up Boot Jack McDaniels and Roosevelt Towns and killed them with a blowtorch.
The NAACP was way down on Fifth Avenue, and whenever there was a lynching, they would hang out a black sign that had white words on it that said a man was lynched. Lynching was so real that when we saw that sign, there was a sense of rage. And then we would call the young people out of Harlem and march around 42nd Street.
2 days after the Mississippi lynchings, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed an anti-lynching bill. But to become law, it still needed to pass the Southern-dominated Senate. Walter White's crusade drew national attention, and Gallup polls showed that a majority of Americans, North and South, favored a federal anti-lynching law.
There was a feeling that there was progress being made and that there were not as many lynchings as before. But from Walter's point of view, it wasn't the number of lynchings that he was concerned with, it was the fact that you did have lynchings. And if you had had only 10, it would have been a great deterrent to the black population.
When the bill reached the Senate floor in January 1938, 17 senators filibustered against it, paralyzing Senate business for 6 weeks. Walter White sought help from FDR, but the president remained silent. Finally, the bill was withdrawn. Nazi propaganda took note of the Mississippi lynchings. One German newspaper proclaimed that compared to the U.S., Germany enforced its racial laws in a humane manner. Germany's racial laws pushed beyond its borders when the Nazis took over Austria in March 1938. Americans, especially Jewish Americans, feared Hitler's spreading tyranny. That June, Hitler's prized heavyweight Max Schmeling came to New York to bring the World Championship back to Germany. Once again, a Joe Louis fight took on political significance.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt loved my dad, and I remember once the story of him calling him to the White House. And he was calling him to the White House to basically feel his muscles and the power of Joe Louis, and with those muscles we could defeat the Germans.
We were so proud of him, and we would tease, Mr. Roosevelt would tease and saying, isn't it marvelous that our wonderful fighter is black? And that if the Nazis want to compete, they have to fight with a black fighter.
Of course, the fight was America versus Hitler's Germany. Democratic, pure America, idealistic, against evil Germany that wanted to conquer and destroy the world. And Schmeling represented that kind of evil. And Louis represented everything we loved in America.
Joe Louis wasn't going to bother to box this guy. No fooling around. I'm stronger than he is. I punch better than he is, and let's waste no time.
Schmeling is down, and he's up. Louis measures him. Louis, right and left to the jaw, or right to the head, and Schmeling is down. The count is 5, 6, 7, 8. The men are in the ring. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Max Schmeling is beaten in 1 round.
The winner and still champion, Joe Louis.
That was the victory that we all yearned for. That made us all just want to leap in the air, 7 feet high.
The nation was vindicated. Blacks were vindicated. Nazism was put down.
Joe Louis had to defend the freedom and democracy, and he held up that flag. To him, he wanted to defeat him because he lost in 1936. But to America and the world, they had to send a signal to Adolf Hitler, and Joe Louis did.
That November, Hitler's campaign against Jews erupted in a night of organized terror.
When I learned about Kristallnacht, I was living in Brooklyn with my family, and we learned how these hooligans went through all the streets of Germany, breaking into synagogues and destroying shop windows and looting and stealing and beating Jews on the heads and pulling the beards of old Jews. And we all sat there absolutely sick.
In those 2 days, 36 Jews were killed, dozens committed suicide, and 20,000 were arrested and sent to detention camps. The Nazis were escalating their plan to drive all Jews from German soil. In desperation, German and Austrian Jews sought refuge, especially in the U.S. But America had kept strict immigration quotas since the early 20s, and the Depression hardened attitudes even more.
The argument that was used was a very potent one. Don't let anybody in any jobs that are available give Americans. And it was hard to fight that kind of argument.
But by the end of 1938, more than 100,000 Jewish children orphaned by Kristallnacht and its aftermath were stranded in overcrowded European shelters. To help ease the crisis, Senator Robert Wagner introduced a child refugee bill to temporarily increase U.S. immigration quotas by admitting 20,000 orphans over a 2-year period.
Mrs. Roosevelt became the main supporter of the bill. She went to the president and told him about the fact that this bill was drafted and asked him whether he would support it. And he said yes, he would, though he would not go out and make it a part of his priority program. That was too dangerous.
Congress was deluged with mail opposing the bill.
Dear Senator Wagner, haven't we got enough Jews already? They own most of the newspapers, radios,
Dear
movies,
Senator Wagner,
most of the big
charity
stores.
begins at home. It is rather inconsistent for the government to now overlook the forgotten man in order to care for the undesirables of other nations.
That spring, while the Wagner Orphans Bill was pending in Congress, America was confronted by another refugee crisis. The SS St. Louis, a German ship carrying 937 Jewish refugees, was turned away by the Cuban government. For a week, they sat within sight of Miami, while they appealed to the U.S. State Department for emergency visas to rescue them.
They never made it. They never made it because they didn't want more Jews, though there were less than 1,000. The attitude in the White House was that they could do nothing about it in face of the existing high barriers in the immigration requirements. At the end of several weeks, that ship with 1,000 Jews was forced in desperation to return to Europe.
Just days before the ship was to land back in Nazi Germany, England, France, Holland, and Belgium agreed to take its passengers. The following month, Wagner's Orphans Bill met with similar rejection. Congress adjourned without ever bringing it to a vote.
And it was a touchy political issue, and it was, again, just like the anti-lynching law, something which FDR had to leave to the congressional leadership, and it failed of passage.
Mrs. Roosevelt was terribly frustrated that certain things didn't happen. And she wished to God it weren't so, but it was. And in the end, she made people understand why progress was slower than they hoped it would be. She also told them not to give up, and for goodness sake not to become meek and not fight very hard. Because she always wanted them to fight just as hard and push just as hard.
Controversy followed Mrs. Roosevelt through that spring, when the Daughters of the American Revolution barred Marian Anderson from singing at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. The DAR's president told a reporter that no Negro would be permitted to appear in their hall.
Mrs. Roosevelt immediately thought she should resign publicly because she knew that this would create an enormous stir, of course.
We know what the Daughters of the American Revolution said to her, which was a slap to us as well, and we know the great sense of relief we felt when Harold Ickes and the others said, if we can't do Constitution Hall, and Eleanor Roosevelt too, let's go to the Lincoln Memorial.
On Easter Sunday, 1939, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes introduced Marian Anderson to a crowd of 75,000 at the Lincoln Memorial.
Marian Anderson was so moved, looking out at the sea of people. As far as the eye could go, there were people and people.
This magnificent woman blessed us in a way that nothing else could or did. I remember standing there with all those people being lifted over, above, and beyond ourselves on the wings of this voice that just picked us up and carried us. We can only dignify our struggle by dignifying the objective of that struggle, which is to be included in an America. But it has to be an America that is worth all that we can do and say. So when she sang, "My country 'tis of thee," she was reminding the country, this is who you truly are. And what has happened to me is a measure of how far you've strayed from that. But this moment, let's get back to who you truly are, America.
6 months later, Europe was at war. When America took up arms in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, world champion Joe Louis enlisted for duty and pushed to desegregate the U.S. military. Of the more than 900 people sent back on the St. Louis, 660 perished in Nazi death camps. Walter White never succeeded in his campaign for an anti-lynch law, but Charles Houston's vision of school desegregation was realized in the landmark Supreme Court decision of 1954.
Got the head built for a crown. Solid, mellow, round, good fellow. That's George the Bomber. Who's the credit to his face? Ace of trunks with a poker face. George Beloy, no job to McCoy. That's George the Bomber. Now set a pace in his face to make it scurry. Can he swing in a ring? Jackie's murder of the first degree. Let's join in and shout hooray. Send that new champ on its way. Solid, mellow, all-round good fellow. That's Joe the Bomber.